As we study the period of what we now refer to as the American Renaissance, we will see complementary and contradictory schools of thought that prevailed in both the mainstream culture and in the social margins of the 19th century. Because of the plethora of voices, perspectives, and artistic sensibilities that grew during this rich time in our literary history, it's difficult for us as students of this literature to discern where these writers gather their influences, and it's equally difficult for us to pin down what they tried to achieve in creating a uniquely American voice. When we think about the big picture of the American Renaissance, it's important to group certain authors together so that we know within which vein they fall in our overarching definition of this time. Although we have not yet studied some of these writers, you may look back to this video as a frame of reference as to how certain authors of this period either complement or contradict the other. Think of it like this. Emerson, Thoreau, and Fuller are the thesis. Poe, Hawthorne, and Melville are the antithesis, and Whitman and Dickinson are the synthesis. The transcendentalists, like Emerson, Thoreau, and Fuller, are the thesis, which means that their arguments prevailed in the 19th century mainstream culture about what it means to be an American, one that embodies individualism, idealism, and democracy with optimal positivity. Poe, Hawthorne, and Melville are the antithesis. These writers will take a dark turn in their subjects and themes in order to express what may be lurking in the American psyche behind the positive rhetoric of the Transcendentalists. The Dark Romantics represent the undercurrent reaction to what the Transcendentalists theorized about the American and his literature. Whitman and Dickinson are the synthesis. These two poets will encapsulate both the thesis and the antithesis. They will show this optimal individualism with positivity, but they will also include the dark depths of the American psyche as it is in the mid-19th century. What we are focusing on this week is the antithesis, which may seem counterintuitive to students. We may think that we must know the thesis thoroughly before we can know the antithesis, but think of it like this instead. We are understanding the Gothic undercurrent in this literary movement that will live in tension with the Transcendentalist movement, but this undercurrent will also present itself in the works of Whitman and Dickinson. Now let's focus a bit more specifically on the antithesis through Hawthorne and Melville. The genius of these two authors lies in their multifaceted approaches to merging two concepts: the age-old literary preoccupation with tragedy and what it means to be an American. The definition of tragedy can be traced back to the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle in his work, The Poetics. It focused on the importance of catharsis, or the purging of pity and fear. Aristotle held that tragedy should be dramatic or symbolic rather than narrative, and it should be character-driven rather than setting-driven. For our purposes, however, let us focus on another definition of tragedy from F.O. Mathiassen's American Renaissance, the seminal text that stabilized the study of American literature and academia, for a more accessible and relevant definition to our study of American authors. Tragedy is the relation of the individual to society and of the nature of good and evil, hence man as a social being. For the hero of tragedy is never merely an individual, he is a man in action, in conflict with other individuals in a definite social order. Tragedy reflects that even the most perfect man cannot be wholly good, but is indeed radically imperfect. However pitiful man may be in his infinite weakness, he is still capable of apprehending perfection and of becoming transfigured by that vision. For example, let's briefly allude to Hawthorne's short story, The Minister's Black Veil. The protagonist or hero of this story, named Reverend Mr. Hooper, is faced with the tension between his own faith and the social pressures of the Puritan theocracy in which he lives. Readers do not know exactly what sin he has committed, but because he is acting upon his own religious convictions to wear the black veil as a symbol of his own sin, we as readers toe the line between whether or not he is good or evil in doing so, and even the townspeople in the story cannot decide if he is pious or if he's an unforgivable sinner. Moreover, his struggle is representative, as his self-conviction is universal and accessible to readers, and how we punish ourselves for the sake of morality, and also how we struggle with what is socially acceptable. He strives for perfection, but through that journey, we see how fatal and tragic that perfection can be. As we read the short stories by Hawthorne and Melville for this section of the course, think about each story individually, and how this American tragic vision helps you better understand the characters and their spots in time in the 19th century. It will also be important to read these stories with the tragic vision in mind, so that any ambiguous content will be more apparent to you for analysis in your assignments.